Hello and welcome to week one. Hopefully you've gotten the opportunity to view the video for Monday and you've gotten the opportunity to explore the D2L website along with reply to the topic number one in the discussion board. If you have not replied to discussion board topic number one, you want to be sure that you do that no later than 8 a.m. May 11th. Anything that comes in after that will not be counted. And this first discussion board post is worth 5 points. Right now, I'm having a good time getting to know everyone, so I look forward to getting to know the rest of the class. I wanted to create this video to discuss, or I should say briefly discuss, the course activities for week one. The first thing that you guys are going to do is read a section in your textbook about the rhetorical situation. Now, along with reading the rhetorical situation, or I should say before you read the rhetorical situation, I want you to just sort of scan the book, read the introduction, read how the book is supposed to work for you. There's some introductory material in the preface section in your textbook that you want to just read to familiarize yourself with how the book is structured. After you do that, you're going to read about the rhetorical situation on pages 3 through 17 in the book. Now, when you think about the rhetorical situation, you want to think about it from the perspective of the reader and the writer. So when you think about audience, purpose, medium, the genre, and stance, you can think about that from the perspective of not only you as the writer, so how is that going to influence how you're writing your essay, but also think about it from the perspective of the reader. How does that influence how you're reading these essays, these works of fiction, and these works of nonfiction? So, and then moving along from there, there's a section in your book that I'm going to have you read about analyzing the text and analyzing literature. Now, in that section, they talk about some active reading strategies that you can incorporate in your reading to help you become a much more attentive and informed reader, to help you effectively write about the things that you're reading. I've also included a lecture on analyzing literature that I usually discuss in my face-to-face courses. Now, this lecture is basically divided, it has two purposes. The first purpose is to describe writing strategies that you can incorporate as you are reading a text. So these are referred to as the reader response task logs that are included throughout the lecture. The other purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to some literary terms such as plot, theme, setting, and character. And each of those reading response task logs involve prompts that you can use to write about setting, character, and theme. And you want to also think about using these reader response task logs to help you read Kafka's Metamorphosis. So for instance, one of those task logs talks about analyzing plot. One of the things that you can do, and I'm going to have you do this on the response assignment number one, is after you read this part number one of Kafka's Metamorphosis, ask yourself some questions about what you think is going to happen next. And what evidence do you have that you've read up to this point that would suggest your forecast? And then that will help you become a much more aware reader as you read parts two and three, because you are trying to see if your forecast is going to be fulfilled. So the analyzing literature lecture supplements the section in your textbook on analyzing a text. The next thing I want you guys to read is a primer of existentialism by Gordon E. Bigelow, which was abbreviated by me. Now, I completely understand that the idea is not for you all to become experts on existentialism by the time you leave this course. However, I wanted to just introduce you to some of the main ideas of this philosophical movement so that you all can see how some of these larger themes influence our contemporary forms of cultural expression. So this article gives you a brief sort of historical context of existentialism, and it also talks about some of the key players, some of the key philosophers in existentialism, such as Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre. And it also discusses some of the American writers who have a lot of existentialist themes in their writing, for instance, William Faulkner. Another thing that this article does is that it breaks down 6 themes of existentialism. And now these themes are not necessarily exact, but these are some of the common reoccurring themes that we see related to existentialism. So when we think about the first one, this idea that human existence precedes essence. This argues, this rejects this Platonic notion that there is this idea of this human universalism, and essentially that to understand human, there is no understanding of humankind, but you have to understand the human individual, and everyone's experience is an individual experience. So you can't necessarily create this larger idea of ethics or what it means to be good or what it means to be evil based off of this larger concept of your understanding of humankind, but rather off of the individual's experience. The next thing that they talk about is absurdity. A lot of existentialists and a lot of existentialist philosophy reject this idea that you can understand human existence just based purely off of reasoning and science. So they reject this idea that the only way to understand the truth is through reason. And they say that there should be a balance between the spiritual realm and the actual tangible, the physical realm, to understand these larger ideas of existence and of truth and of beauty. So this idea of the absurd essentially suggests that it's absurd to think that we can control nature and that we can use reason to control things that are out of our reach. Another theme that's going to be discussed is alienation and this idea of this disassociation from God. One of the philosophers that is not really touched on too much in the article, but that's a huge contributor to existentialist philosophy is Friedrich Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was famous for the statement that God is dead. And it's not necessarily the physical death of God, but the construct, the institutional construct of God, and how we as a society have built up this concept of God and acted out this concept of God within the religious institution. And so the existentialists believe that, once we have used this, have claimed this idea that of the death of God and the idea of the death of the concept of God, we end up becoming alienated because there's this disassociation from a higher power. So it has a sense of creating a fear of anxiety and of alienation and of isolation, which segues into number 4, which is fear and anxiety. A lot of the existentialists believe that once we have this, the recognition, or once we become aware of our mortality, we have this sense of fear and anxiety because we understand that our life is not forever. So how we spend our life is extremely important. And so being aware of what you're doing and how you're spending that life and how that goes into your overall existence, and how we create this idea of the afterworld and what we do here in the present world and how that might affect our afterworld, creates these ideas of fear and anxiety as we are living our present life. The 5th one deals with nothingness. Again, this relates to this idea of this disassociation from God. So once we have used reason and science to reason out the presence of God and to deconstruct the construct of the religious institution, then we have this sense of nothingness, that nothing really matters, which kind of leads to sometimes a lot of cynical ideas, and going back to this idea of this Nietzschean concept of nihilism, that nothing really matters. There's no real true purpose to life. And so just this idea to ask, what is the purpose of human existence would be absurd in itself, because if everything is based off of an individual experience and nothing is collective, then one person could look at everything as just a random act of events that have no meaning. And finally, this idea of freedom. How do we define freedom? Are we free just because we have the choice to make decisions? Are we free because we purchase? Does purchasing power give us freedom? Does the attainment of wealth give us freedom? How do we define concepts of freedom? One in your article, they discuss how French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about the German occupation in France during World War II, and he questioned this idea of freedom, basically saying that freedom is a state of mind. So to be free is to actually be autonomous. Once you are able to separate yourself from the society that binds you, from the society that tells you that this is what's acceptable and this is what's not acceptable, and you're able to deconstruct that and live on, on the periphery and live autonomous, that's when you truly gain a sense of freedom. So as you're going through these themes on existentialism, I want you to try to apply these themes to your reading of Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And I also want you to think about the main character, Gregor. Think about how his family feels about him. Think about how Greek feels about him. Think about do you identify with Gregor? So for instance, do you find yourself going every single day to a thankless job just so that you can attain this thing that society says that you have to attain, whether it be a house, a car, or a family? So think about those things as you think about some of these larger concepts as you are reading The Metamorphosis, these existentialist concepts, and see if you can relate some of these things to your reading of the actual story. Moving on to The Metamorphosis, I want you guys to read part 1 for next week. As you'll see, The Metamorphosis is an extremely carefully written story. That was one of the things that Franz Kafka was famous for. He spent months and months and months on just one sentence alone. So he's a very painstakingly careful writer, and you'll be able to see that in his story. I have to admit, the first time that I read The Metamorphosis, I did not particularly care for it. But then once I read it again, and once I read it again much more actively, it became one of my favorite stories ever written. And I enjoy reading it every single semester with my students. So after you read part 1, I want you to do the actual response assignment. And let me find the response assignment sheet. The response assignment has to be written in a Word document format, and it needs to be uploaded in the Dropbox. It needs to be uploaded in the Dropbox no later than 8 a.m. May 15th, 2012. So you want to make sure that you answer those 3 questions and everything is typed. I've also included a grading rubric. The things that I'm looking for well thought out, detailed responses with contextual examples. So it's one thing to say that Greet hated her brother, but it's another thing to say, here are examples of why I think Greet did not care for her brother after he became a bug. Okay, so I'm looking for actual concrete examples from the text, from the Metamorphosis and the textbook when you're developing your responses to response number 1. And once you do that, I also want you to start thinking about your topics for your annotated bibliography and your researched argument essay. Again, this is going to be one topic for 2 papers. Okay, so you're going to keep developing that topic in your annotated bibliography and in your researched argument essay. You want to choose wisely because you are going to be connected to this idea, this topic, for the rest of the semester. On week 2, I'm going to have a couple of strategies that you can use to help you develop your topics a little bit further. So as always, if you have any questions, please post to the discussion board. Continue to discuss on the discussion board. And if you have any questions, let me know. Good luck, happy writing, and I will see you in cyberspace.